Today's video is brought to you by Incogni, the easy way to protect your personal data from being sold online by data brokers. Did you know data brokers collect and sell your personal information from your email and phone number to even your home address? A recent example is the BT Group ransomware attack, which left sensitive data from their BT conferencing servers exposed, putting countless individuals at risk. With Incogni, you don't have to spend hundreds of hours removing your data manually. They contact data brokers on your behalf, request the removal of your personal information, and keep it off the market with regular follow-ups. Whether it's shielding yourself from identity theft or simply reducing those annoying robocalls, Incogni does the hard work for you. So take control of your privacy, and with their family and friends plan, protect your loved ones as well. So, all you need to do to reclaim your personal data is use Incogni, and you can use the code SHADOWS at incogni.com/shadows to get 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/shadows, because your data deserves better. And now today's video. Some of the most important conversations in history have happened over the phone. JFK famously resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis with several phone calls. Richard Nixon called Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong as they stood on the moon. Yet most of you probably haven't heard of the call that caused a community to erupt and exposed a deadly cover-up. This phone call wasn't made by a president or a journalist, but by a housewife. By spring of 1978, Lewis Gibbs' family had been living in Love Canal, Niagara Falls, New York for roughly a year. In that time, her son, 5-year-old Michael, had gone from being in perfect health to experiencing seizures and asthma-like symptoms with no clear cause. Lois suspected that the explanation lay in her son's school, or rather, beneath the school. When she called the school superintendent to request a transfer, Lois had no idea that her actions would forever change the face of American environmentalism. To fully understand Love Canal, we must first learn about the man who started it all. In the 1890s, William T. Love purchased a stretch of land in the city of Niagara Falls, through which the Niagara River flowed. His dream was to construct a hydroelectric canal that would be the power base of an idealized industrial urban community that he called Model City. However, his dreams turned to dust in the wind of technological innovations which made his dam outdated before it was even built. Love abandoned the canal before it was finished, leaving a 1-kilometer-long trench lined with concrete. Now, we've met Lois Gibbs, the first of our protagonists, so now let's meet our villain. The developing and funding company moved to the old Love Canal site in 1903. In 1909, it changed its name to the Hooker Electrochemical Company. At the start, the company produced common household chemicals. When World War I broke out, Hooker and other American companies filled the gap left by the German chemical industry with product lines that ranged from medicine to chemical weapons. Hooker began producing monochlorobenzol, a key ingredient in picric acid. Picric acid is a highly volatile explosive which saw widespread use during the Great War. During World War II, the Hooker Electrochemical Company also produced arsenic trichloride for poison gases and played an important role in the Manhattan Project. And all of this shows that Hooker held shares in human suffering long before the 1970s. With its rapid growth, Hooker soon found itself searching for a place to dump all of its waste products, and its eyes fell on the abandoned canal. For years, the area had been used as a municipal and industrial dump site by the city. Still, local children enjoyed swimming in the parts that remained relatively untouched. Hooker sought to rectify the situation. In a mere 10 years, they drained the canal and dumped over 21,000 tons of chemical waste products into it. They never provided the full list of what was disposed of in the canal, but testing has revealed over 200 chemical compounds in the soil surrounding the area. 12 of these compounds are known carcinogens, including benzene, which causes leukemia. The chemical waste was placed in metal drums or other containers, which were then covered with a thin layer of soil. Meanwhile, the city of Niagara Falls continued to grow, reaching a population of 90,000 by 1950. The city school board was in desperate need of a new elementary school. In 1952, under threat of eminent domain, Hooker was forced to cover the landfill with clay and sell the site to the school board for just $1. Their only written warning about the chemicals came in the form of a legal clause which absolved them of any responsibility for injuries. The school board immediately began construction of the 99th Street Elementary School, where 5-year-old Michael Gibbs would eventually attend. At the same time, dozens of new homes were built in the area. Construction workers accidentally damaged some of the metal drums, causing them to leak into the surrounding soil. This was the first of 2 blows which would knock the wall down. Since the earliest days of the community, residents of Love Canal complained of a strong chemical stench in the streets. Hooker employees joked that it was the smell of money. Strange puddles appeared on roads and playgrounds. Children played with the fire rocks that sparked when thrown at the ground. The residents reported these incidents to the city. Can you guess what their response was? Well, it wasn't enough. In the 1970s, the area experienced a series of wet winters which raised the water table. And with that second blow, well, the wall came down. Lois Gibbs wasn't the first to voice concerns over the chemical landfill. Her suspicions had been raised by an article in the Niagara Gazette, which was published months earlier. In 1977, reporter Michael Brown attended what should have been a dull council meeting in another part of Niagara Falls. At the meeting, Hooker representatives proposed opening a chemical landfill nearby. A young woman stood up and loudly begged the audience to reject the proposal. She was from Love Canal, and she explained tearfully that the chemicals from Hooker's dump site were poisoning her community. Brown decided to look into it, having no idea that he would play a pivotal role in uncovering one of the biggest environmental scandals in US history. Digging through years of reporting, he found several articles which indicated that chemicals were leaking into the community. In 1977, testing revealed high levels of Mirax, an insecticide produced by Hooker in nearby Lake Ontario. Mirax is known to cause cancer in lab animals. However, it was a chance encounter later that year which pushed Brown to throw himself fully into the story. Michael Brown was in Buffalo, New York, covering an unrelated story when he bumped into a chemical engineer who had consulted on Love Canal for the city of Niagara Falls. In response to the residents' concerns, the city had hired a firm to investigate the presence of chemicals in the soil and the water. At the end of the conversation, the engineer left Brown with a dire warning. If you don't find out what's in that canal, your children or your children's children are going to start having problems. Brown wrote several articles on Love Canal for the Niagara Gazette, but would anyone take these findings seriously? Well, actually, a handful of unlikely heroes would take his research to the next level. On October 1st, 1978, Luella Kenny took her son, John Allen, to the hospital. This was becoming a worrying routine. The 7-year-old had been hospitalized 3 times in the last few months. John had nephrotic syndrome, a disease that is usually curable in children, but his symptoms kept returning every time he was discharged from the hospital. This is a disease where the kidneys release too much protein into the urine. It can lead to serious complications, including blood clots and high blood pressure. That day, he was unable to keep food down and was having trouble breathing. He was admitted to the intensive care unit, where doctors were once again unable to find the cause of his relapse. 3 days later, he passed away from cardiac arrest. The family and the community were fractured by the loss of one so young. Luella and her husband used their grief to fuel research into their son's death. Luella, a cancer research assistant, immediately demanded an autopsy. The autopsy revealed a pulmonary embolism, which is extremely unusual in patients with nephrotic syndrome. Now, so much time has passed since John Allen Kenny's death that we may never know if the chemical dump site played a role in his passing. However, Luella Kenny remains convinced that Hooker Electrochemical Company was to blame for their loss. Once she made the connection to the chemical dump site, Luella joined the HOA and threw herself into activism. While all of this was going on, Michael Brown kept digging into the Love Canal story. When he visited Love Canal, he went door to door interviewing residents. This is how he found Mr. and Mrs. Voorhees. Now, the home should be a refuge, but the Voorheeses were plagued by a silent intruder for decades. Eileen and Edwin lived on 99th Street along the canal. For the better part of 20 years, they had played host to an unwanted guest, a foul-smelling black sludge which seeped in through a wall in their basement. Their pleas to the city for assistance simply fell on deaf ears. Later testing revealed 9 separate chemical compounds in the basement air, at least 2 of which are carcinogenic. A state biophysicist determined that they shouldn't stay in their basement for more than 2.5 minutes at a time. At the time, the couple had no idea the danger they were in. To them, it was more of a nuisance than anything else. Others, though, were not so fortunate. A few doors down, their daughter Karen lived with her husband. The pair spent all of their savings on making additions to their home, including a pool. One day in 1968, an unseen force pushed the pool 2 feet out of the ground. They eventually pulled the pool out, only to watch in horror as blue, yellow, and orange liquids filled the hole and flooded the garden. The chemical stew ate through a wooden fence and killed their plants in droves. Karen was pregnant at the time. Months later, she gave birth to a baby girl named Shari. Shari was born with partial deafness, congenital heart defects, nasal blockages, and a cleft palate. She was later diagnosed with an intellectual disability and an enlarged liver. As with Michael Gibbs and John Allen Kenny, there was no family history that would explain this. Alright, so now let's return to Lois Gibbs as she sits in her kitchen in 1978, gathering the courage to call the school superintendent. Gibbs is not a confrontational woman. She struggles with public speaking and making phone calls, yet as she hears the superintendent's words, her anxiety is trumped by outrage. He would only transfer Michael if she provided 2 doctor's notes which identified the school's environment as the cause of the mysterious illnesses. The superintendent was deeply skeptical of any dangers the chemicals below may pose. After all, none of the other children were ill. Lois hung up, but the superintendent's words stuck with her. If the chemicals were making Michael ill, then surely other people must be experiencing similar problems. Now, many of you have probably been involved in disputes with your child's school. Lois Gibbs took their disagreement to the next level. She started going door to door, asking neighbors about medical issues such as asthma, miscarriages, cancer, anything that couldn't be explained. She also started a petition to have 99th Street School temporarily shut down. The issue quickly garnered widespread attention in the community, and the residents began pressuring the state government to take action. The State Department of Health ordered blood tests for thousands of residents. Meanwhile, the results of environmental testing were announced on August 2, 1978. A group of residents, including Lois Gibbs, drove over 300 miles to the state capital of Albany to hear the results in person. Back in Niagara Falls, the community held its breath. Groups huddled around radios and televisions, anxiously awaiting the news. State Health Commissioner Robert Whalen told the crowd that the testing had revealed the presence of over 80 organic chemical compounds in Love Canal. This included unacceptable levels of benzene and known carcinogen. Pregnant people in the areas closest to the canal were at an increased risk of miscarriages and birth defects. In the next breath, he ordered the evacuation of pregnant women and children under 2 living in the 2 streets directly adjacent to the canal, and in the meantime, the beginning of the school year was to be delayed until cleanup operations could commence. 99th Street School was shut down. Those left behind were urged to remain vigilant. The community was confused and outraged at the limited evacuation. They felt abandoned. When Lois Gibbs returned to Love Canal that evening, she found a neighborhood on the verge of a riot. A group of protesters were gathered near the school, and tensions were rising. Despite her social anxiety, Gibbs calmed the restless crowd. She announced the formation of the Love Canal Homeowners Association, whose purpose was to conduct further studies and organize protests. With the help of Beverly Pagan, a biologist from the Roswell Park Memorial Institute, they uncovered alarming statistics of miscarriages and birth defects. A survey of mothers in Love Canal found that those who moved to the wetter areas were at 3 times higher risk of miscarrying than they were before. Many of the HOA's findings were viewed with skepticism, as the study cohort was very small and those conducting the survey were not scientists. A similar story, by way of the New York Department of Health, found that 12% of children born in the wetter areas of Love Canal had birth defects, as compared to 7.5% of children in the dry areas. However, all the statistics in the world can't quantify the hardship and suffering that these people experienced. Days after the initial evacuation was announced in August 1978, Lois Gibbs was flown to Washington, D.C. to discuss the situation in Love Canal with White House staffers. The White House agreed to fund a relocation package for those already set to evacuate, but still refused to order a general evacuation. Lois Gibbs once again left the meeting feeling frustrated and ignored, but she wouldn't let those feelings linger. The cleanup operation faced problems even before it began. Hooker Chemical, now owned by Occidental Petroleum, insisted that the deed they signed with the school board meant that they were not responsible for removing the chemicals. The Niagara Falls School Board, Environmental Protection Agency, and Occidental Petroleum all pointed the finger at each other. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter provided emergency federal funding for the cleanup, but it was years before a permanent funding source was created. When the cleanup operation finally began, the LCHA was not satisfied with the steps taken to protect the remaining residents. They had to push for the placement of evacuation buses in the event of a major chemical accident. When Lois Gibbs asked a state spokesperson what they should do if an accident should happen, he replied, "I wouldn't wait for the bus, I'd run like hell." Now, we've spoken quite a bit about the Love Canal Homeowners Association, but who spoke for the renters? When Eileen Thornton of Griffin Manor attended an LCHA meeting in August of 1978, she had high hopes that they could join forces. After all, Griffin Manor, a federal housing project with over 200 rented apartments, was the same distance from the canal as Lois Gibbs' home. Her suggestion was met with rolled eyes and anger. She didn't own her home, so as they said, she had nothing to lose financially. They didn't know that Eileen had already lost something. Her son, Gregory, who passed away from leukemia years before. When the initial reports about the chemical waste came out, Eileen wondered if her son had been a victim. Not deterred by the rejection, she founded the Concerned Love Canals Renters Association, or CLCRA, together with Agnes Jones and Vera Starks. Like the LCHA, they campaigned for medical testing and relocation by speaking with the media. Despite their tireless efforts, the CLCRA didn't get nearly as much media attention as the LCHA. And the reason was insidious and ugly. Eileen, Agnes, and Vera were black, like the majority of Manor residents. The LCHA, by contrast, was primarily made up of white women. To combat this, the CLCRA got backing from the NAACP and hired a lawyer to represent their complaints. They also faced a State Department unwilling to perform blood tests on residents, as well as a distrust from residents towards those tests. The trauma of the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study was still very fresh in local memory. The first round of blood testing revealed elevated risk of liver disease in those living closest to the canal. However, none of the participants actually had liver disease at the time of testing. As mentioned at the beginning of today's video, the story of Love Canal is a key part of the history of environmentalism in America. This is because it led to the formation of a vital piece of legislation known colloquially as the Superfund. Now, our American listeners may have already heard of a few Superfund sites, such as East Palestine in Ohio. It all started with Love Canal and the dispute over who would pay for the cleanup. In 1979, Tom Jorling of the EPA drafted legislation which would force chemical corporations to pay into a superfund to cover the costs of future disasters. His timing was absolutely terrible. He proposed this legislation at a time when decreased government oversight was becoming increasingly popular. As a result, the Superfund bill stagnated. It needed a push, and a series of critical hearings gave it that massive shove. The hearings began in October of 1978 and heard hundreds of witnesses. Some of the most shocking pieces of testimony came from the dumping period between 1942 and 1952. You see, between 1947 and 1949, a resident of a nearby area recalled seeing fires from a backyard at least once per week. Several residents remembered regular explosions, with one claiming that debris landed in front of her house several streets away from the dump. One day, in 1955, the earth underneath a playground crumbled, leaving a large crater. Several leaking barrels were exposed. Some children began playing in the liquid, and one boy received chemical burns to his eye. Luckily, he made a complete recovery. The contents of those barrels remains unknown. A memo from 1958 revealed that several more children were burned when barrels containing an ingredient used in poison gas surfaced near a playground. The author of the memo advised Hooker against taking action because by that point, the land belonged to the school board. After the hearings, President Carter gave the Superfund legislation his stamp of approval. Finally, on December 11, 1980, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act was enacted and the Superfund was created. Today, there are 1,340 sites on the Superfund's national priority list. Since its birth, the community of Love Canal was largely peaceful. Yet some leaked test results pushed it beyond what many of the residents would consider plausible. On May 19, 1980, the results of blood tests showed that 11 of 36 residents had chromosomal damage. The cohort was too small to be useful, and there was no control group. Nevertheless, this news whipped protesters into a frenzy. The Love Canal Homeowners Association had begun using the abandoned school as a headquarters for over a year. Now they gathered in front of it, shouting and throwing bottles. One man poured gasoline in the shape of the word EPA on the ground and set it on fire. When the EPA sent 2 employees, a scientist and a PR representative, to calm the crowd, it only riled them more. Lois Gibbs took the 2 men inside the school out of concern for their safety. Only then did she realize that she had 2 valuable bargaining chips. While the FBI and Niagara Falls PD gathered outside, Gibbs got on the phone with Congressman John LaFalce. She gave him a dire warning to pass on to the president. If he didn't order a full evacuation by Wednesday the 21st, quote, "What we've done here today will look like a Sesame Street picnic compared to what we'll do then." The following Wednesday, the White House agreed to temporarily evacuate all Love Canal families. In total, 700 were relocated. Most homeowners in the area were given the opportunity to sell their houses to the state. The renters from Griffin Manor received no such compensation. The revelations from Love Canal never stopped. In 1990, court documents were released which indicated that the US Army may have dumped radioactive waste from the Manhattan Project into the canal. For a long time, the neighborhood, once imagined as a model city, lay silent. In the 1990s, the government began to sell houses at a bargain price to young families. Many of the new residents claimed that they had no idea of the area's history before moving in. Although Love Canal was removed from the Superfund website in 2004, history might be repeating itself. Currently, residents have also complained about unexplained health problems and the smell of chemicals in houses. Although recent testing hasn't revealed any cause for concern, perhaps we will find ourselves with another disaster on our hands in a few years. But finally, what of our protagonists? Amazingly, Lois Gibbs was never charged for her part in the hostage situation. Instead, she founded the Centre for Health, Environment and Justice. Luella Kenny has returned to Love Canal and now runs tours of the former Superfund site. What happened to Eileen Thornton is unknown. It's hard to measure the suffering caused by the Love Canal disaster. Studies of its impact on the long-term health of former residents have been limited by lack of data from before 1978. We have said little of the babies born with medical conditions and deformities, or of the employees who developed leukemia after working with benzene. To discuss it all would take several videos. For now, as we face an uncertain environmental future, let us take heart in the memory of a housewife who changed the world.